All right. Welcome to Cyber Tech and Risk. And today we're talking about trusted cloud, but we have two specialists here. It's hard to talk about myself that way, but we're going to cover DevSecOps and we're going to have some geek out going on here. And we're going to have some questions for each other, see if we can make the other stump the chump or stumble, but we'll see. Ophelia, maybe you want to start by introducing yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Shlomo. My name is Opheliar Chan. I'm one of the leads in Canada. My official title is Application Security Advisory Services Lead in Canada for Accenture. And so I have spent a lot of time in the AppSec, sort of like DevSecOps space in the last, I would say 10, 15 years. Spent quite a bit of time, building AppSec programs for different people, looking at DevSecOps, being a pen tester. I think I was a pen tester for a good 8 years. But that's kind of my background, all software security all the time. And for a good portion of that time in consulting, specifically various types of organizations. You want to introduce yourself, Shlomo?
Sure. CTO at Benchmark Corp. Basically, I'm trying to re-engineer all the practices around DevSecOps. So I'm contributing to the CDF, to DevOps Institute, writing courseware for DevSecOps, and trying to change how we practice. So I think both of us have had discussions before, and they're usually really fun. So I'm looking forward to getting some insights. But both of us, our entire background have been application security, focused on DevSecOps. Same for myself, previous CISO for application security and site reliability engineering for a Fortune 500. And now I'm on the practicing side of helping other customers. So maybe with that, do you want me to start?
Yeah, sure. I think Brian was suggesting that we have kind of a little bit of fireside chat kind of situation here, and then take questions or comments from the audience as they come in. So I think we both agreed that we would try to prepare a couple of questions, then maybe just to have a free-form chat about whatever we feel are useful things to the audience. So go for it.
For sure. All right, so from my side, we all know how DevSecOps is basically taking the bailiwick of security and trying to integrate it with the rest of the momentum that's already happening within the DevOps motion. But there's one extra piece that's happening that they have to consider, which is, governance frameworks, globally recognized governance frameworks, which don't really cater too well to agile practices. So can you elaborate to me, you've had customer pains and challenges with regards to, I have a security framework, I want to operate agile and work with these guys rather than being a block. How do you see customers, or how do you help customers get over those governance framework challenges when they're trying to operate a DevSecOps practice?
Okay, that is a very loaded question, as all of the DevSecOps questions really are. So I think we've had a very similar discussion in this area around like distilling these particular governance frameworks into their base parts, right? And then figuring out what, with the auditors specifically, what are the things that they absolutely do need to see in terms of artifacts or evidence, and then learning how to collect that evidence in certain formats using the pipeline itself, right? And then also learning what parts of your pipeline are the bits that do actually produce the kind of evidence that they're looking for. There are some things that you're not really going to get away from, like documentation and things like that, that they just have to see it, and it is a mandate to have, and those are not very agile. So some tools that can help generate things like network diagrams and so on are super helpful as well, because you have to give the auditor something, your internal and external auditors stuff to work with, right? So that's the first kind of question, is you take this framework and you distill it down into the bits and pieces that you absolutely need, the evidence that you absolutely need, right? And then you figure out from that, what are the tools in parts of this process that we can actually use to generate those things so that we don't have to do them manually? And then what are the couple of things that we should, set aside time for in a sprint to manually maintain, because the auditor needs to see it, right, in some format. And then you can go back to the auditor with a pilot group and just sort of say like, okay, here's what we can generate and here's what we can throw together in a week's time, for example, just before the audit. Is that good enough to get us through the audit and also get us to our baseline security model? And it's like a long journey to get there to a certain degree, but there's lots that you can do to make that process a tiny bit easier in just by identifying what part of the pipeline or what part of the process already kind of generate certain pieces of that, and then just auto make sure you have a repository for those things so that you can pull those things out afterwards, right? So the fun part about, I think, the journey to the cloud has been that a lot of these like asset management type questions now, and what is there, is a lot easier to generate now than it used to be. And like most of the cloud providers are going there for themselves anyway. So taking advantage of all those new pieces, all those new functions in the cloud are something that definitely we look with I look with my clients to see how much of that we can leverage.
So if I summarize, you're basically saying when you break it down and distill it, you take the parts that are possible to automate, put them into that pipeline, get that evidence collected by the pipeline itself to other tools as needed, like ITSMs and things like that. You mentioned a couple pieces that I wanted to maybe elaborate on or add to. Documentation you see as separate, but there's some recent advancements today where you can do GitOps related documentation. What means is, let's say I build an environment, it'll read the Terraform and update the documentation to participate and say what was created. So automation for documentation, I think, is there. Education is one of those exceptions, like PCI asks for education that everybody's facilitating. But now, if you really think about it, maybe if I take what you've applied and then say, what's the outcome of that, would be people can focus on educating the people so that they don't get into the scenarios that those controls are, in the need of fixing it. Rather, you understand. So do you think, have you seen that with your clients, that once they've done this, they have more time to educate and uplift?
Okay, so that's also a multi-level question. So from an education standpoint, the education, I guess, industry, the security education industry is moving towards just-in-time training, right? And close feedback loops on that part. So there's, from a secure coding standpoint, for example, there's lots of new, not even new, but lots of, I guess, becoming more popular IDE plugins and like GitOps plugins and ways to integrate like 5-minute videos into tickets, right? So there's a way to get the training in there without doing like CBT modules and have that tracked as well, right? So you can hit that through your pipeline as well. From a observability standpoint, once you hit some of the observability, like you integrate the concept of security observability into your regular like pipeline observability, you start getting distillations of your vulnerability information or like the threat information that you're putting through the pipeline, and you can use that to educate people and prioritize as well. So a lot of the work that I'm doing with clients around like distilling their vulnerability management information is really identifying top like issues and then spending the time very specifically, like this is where the most noise is, this is where your most critical issue is, and it's taking up 3 or 4 cycles a quarter. So why don't we just train on that one thing, do secure code review, go through an education, I would say, almost like a tiny program, like a targeted program specifically for this group, and then get rid of the problem and move on.
Agreed. So I look at that as that's handling the dev portion, or maybe even the ops portion of it. I meant more of like the business on LMS, teaching them about governance frameworks so that they have the understanding of why they're doing what they're doing, so that the governance framework is met as they start creating products. So it's the product oriented training. Additionally, I totally agree with the the tooling that's coming out. Like I even aware of like Sonatype has a browser plugin, so that if you
Mhm.
look at open source libraries, it gives you the rating of the open source library as you're intending to download it. It'll be like, don't do that. That's a bad one. Pick another version. So I do see the side of giving tooling capabilities to developers early on. I see the training occurring, as you mentioned it, more just in time. But I was also going from the business perspective of if a security professional is not tied up trying to get everybody to do what he wants because the pipeline's doing it for him, then he has time to actually educate the organization based on data classification, PCI compliance, all those types of other things, so that the business orients its products around the security, so that it's in mind, and it becomes part of everybody's, not just the developers and operations, understanding, like having innovation potential, because you're not so burdened by compliance of the teams, fostered by what you're asking them to do.
Yeah, I would say that the innovation potential doesn't necessarily come with, like, I would hope that you could deconstruct a lot of the compliance-based measures into more actionable things in the pipeline, so that you don't even need to start educating people specifically on the compliance frameworks, but more on the objectives behind security as a whole, right? And so that might be something that you want to focus on, but I wouldn't like start teaching people necessarily about PCI very specifically.
Well, that one's a requirement. So for those that are
Yeah,
listening, you have to do that.
you have to do that, but I wouldn't be spending my SME time on distilling that further. I'd be spending it on like turning the very high level instructions into like things that are actionable and inside of what they're already doing. So making it into habitual things, as opposed to trying to educate. Like there's spending time in front of a room lecturing people, and then there's spending time building it into the process so that you don't think about it anymore.
Agreed. I just think there's people outside of IT that needs to understand it as well, that they need that education so they understand what they're trying to produce.
What's
Okay,
your recommendation there then?
that's
You've
where
obviously
learning.
given some thought.
Oh, okay. So like the context there is learning management software that's out there. Usually the content's quite poor. So
Okay.
it's always dated, super dated. And you're like, dude, is this even PCI DSS version that I'm looking for? Anyways, what I'd suggest is then they actually spend time on creating very relevant content for the rest of the business to understand the value of what they're producing for the customers and what's being fostered by the IT department, so that you get a business justification for what you're doing within the rest of the business that don't participate within IT. But I'm going to shift into a different, I just like ask a different question, and then I'm all yours after that. I see the biggest issue in all my practicing that I do today within customers is this idea that security gates, and that 100% compliance. I have so many friends that are CISOs that say 100% compliance reflects maturity. Shouldn't our compliance standards continuously prevent people from hitting 100 so that they have something to target rather than hit it and then stagnate? Do you think, I'm asking two layers to it, and then the second question to that is, do we need to change how we perceive governance and security fitness to move away from gates and move towards improvement and degradation, the responsiveness of DevSecOps with regards to your state? So go where you want with that. I know I asked more than one question, which makes it more fun.
Yeah. Well, like I think you asked some of the some of the answers there are obviously yes. And one of we're having the discussion about DevSecOps because people want to move to responsiveness. People want to move to a more to a less static version of compliance, right? I think the real question is how do we get there, as opposed to whether or not that's what we want, because that's
For sure.
part of the premise, right? So people are I feel like people are bought into that concept, right? But the question then is how, right? And then where do you focus? And there, like super easy answer to that is, as you mentioned, right, is like focusing on trending and focusing on like, what are our targets today? What are our targets supposed to be tomorrow? Building it based on a maturity model view of, our services today and where we want to be. Are we hitting those like very specific targets? So I split and like, feel free to jump in because you've obviously thought about this as well, right? So it's like, are you agreed that we have like 3 levels of things that we're kind of looking for from a like overall, like, are we doing the right thing for our organization kind of question on a annual or like regular basis, right? One of them is like, how compliant are we? Because you do need a certain level of compliance in order to operate and do business, right? Like, you do need to learn about, as you mentioned, PCI. You do have to have a training module that you are tracking, that everybody takes, understand what this thing is, right? And then there's the level of like, what are we trying to move forward in the organization from a maturity model perspective in terms of like projects and capabilities and increasing our ability to respond to different things. And then there's also things like operational metrics. So like, how effective are the things that we currently have? How effectively are we using the people that we have? Where are we missing people to support capabilities and all that kind of stuff? So I'd say that there's usually those, 3 business layers, and they're not unusual for people who have to run businesses to think about it. At a microscopic scale, every team then has to like worry about those things if they want to be doing DevSecOps kind of effectively within the bounds of what their mission is in a year, right?
I took notes on what you were saying because I think one piece, so not to coin terms that are used to name COVID, the different variants, Delta. Delta is the most important metric you can go forward with to support DevOps. Where do I start? How do I get this to be adopted? I find if you push all the metrics up and you come to, let's say, the CISO, or even higher that you maybe the CTO and CIO that the CISO reports to, I generally, or if the CISO reports directly to the board, that's fine as well, depending on the org. The context is, once you present it, you need to reinforce the organizations that Delta, regardless of starting point, let's say you're 4% compliant and now you're 10, reward the 6% growth and then change the degradation. Like I find that's how organizations occur. Do not leave a BU or a department that's stagnated or degraded. If that's the case, go to that leader, find out what they're doing wrong. So you talked about effectiveness. That leader is ineffective. You need to find a leader or train that person if it didn't work before. I generally find if you've already tried to adopt this and they didn't, they're ineffective, but that might be too harsh. And then measure human metrics. So like, we developed DevOps Equilibrium. We'll launch it at DevOps World, which is coming out, I think, in a week. The context behind it is, as you said, how effective are the practices that I'm doing, so I know which ones need to be fixed so I can scale to all the other products. Because as you know, no organization manages all the products. They manage the ones that make the most revenue. But in reality, they're all risk. So I don't know if you see it the same way, but I feel like if you don't make effective methods based on the metrics of how people use the process, you'll never scale to all your risk avenues, and you won't be able to improve across the board. You'll pick tactically, which is not the right method, because exploits don't care if you're tactical or not.
Well, you have to begin tactically, right? To start getting data points, and then do sanity checking on, are those the right data points to move forward with? But as you go and some things become obvious, because again, they become habitual for people, you can stop tracking them because nobody cares. But you're correct, like the backsliding, the improvement, right? The cadence, the rate at which you're improving, or the rate at which you're making the change, is important, rather than the actual number. Like, you're gonna start somewhere. Does it matter where you start, as long as you're starting? Right.
Agreed. I think this is working really well, so I'm gonna ask another one.
Actually, no, I'm gonna ask you one.
Okay, go for it.
We're
All right,
out of time.
All right, go for it.
We were talking previously about like the practical aspect of like running DevOps in an organization, and how that, the challenges around, really running Agile in a security team, really running Agile in an organization, and then, making sure that security is an overlay, is a function, is like integrated, and not just like, oh, there's a bunch of security people getting loaned out to dev teams here and there to do all the security work and then go away. So talk to me a little bit about like, what does that mean? Agile, like when you're running into these organizations and you're talking to them about like running Agile, about actually doing like say an Agile or DevSecOps onboarding process, and then like the new RACI matrix and like all these kinds of things, like what does that look like when you talk to people? What are the directions you start taking first?
Okay, so the realization that there will be a duality of operating models. So my context there, the most important thing is that point is, even though I'm adopting a new practice and I'm training incrementally, you can't just go DevSecOps. You have to take the application security team, InfoSec, cybersecurity, and come in and say, even internal audit, because they're all parts of your organization of IT security. The context there is you need to teach them how to practice just generalized Agile and to do incremental approaches to current state to future state. You can then get to DevSecOps when they're ready to contribute in the context of CI/CD pipelines, which is where we're seeing security being embedded. But if they don't practice that way, then what happens is you get blame and anger, because what happens is you're coming in and slowing me down. And everybody knows all day DevOps did like research on elite DevOps organizations. They dislike the security team even more due to their ineffective approach. So train the team, incrementally go from, Agile to coding practices to get to DevSecOps. That's the way I've been doing it. It has to be incremental training. Once they're ready for that, then you can come back to the business and say, okay, I can now operate within the context of this pipeline. I can add value. I have my operating model that considers how I measure and not just slap and tell people what needs to be fixed because you have these vulnerabilities. But the reality is that when you measure, that's when you find the problems. And then the first time you measure, no one's compliant. So if no one's compliant to start, you can't start by gating. The last piece, as you mentioned yourself, is the RACI matrix. I know it's such an old school thing to do, but the reality of mapping out all the new responsibilities or new things that are created as a byproduct of embedding security in the context of CI/CD, which could be, how do I measure fitness on CI/CD? That's proprietary methods, but that you do, and then how does a person take that digital representation of security and manage it? How do I update it regularly? How do I handle automation artifacts that are security related? This is the practical side, and the RACI matrix very clearly distinguishes, who do I consult? Who's responsible for those new artifacts so they continuously improve, which is the core of DevSecOps. So I feel like what you were saying is, as long as the RACI matrix facilitates covering the things they didn't think about, and the security team practices prior to engagement and understands the old model still exists for some teams that aren't ready for DevSecOps from a development side yet, that they have to manage that duality. It's very painful to manage a duality of operational models. Very painful.
Yeah, I would say not the duality, the rainbow.
Meaning more than one, fair enough, or more than two. I hope there's only two. Like, there should be the way I did it and the way now you've trained me to do it. But yes, there could be more.
There's the intermediary state where people are getting used to things, and then there's the after state where people are like, okay, I've got this, but I'm going to make these improvements.
On that point, I asked a question. How do you handle transition periods? Fast, slow, what are the ramifications when you're transitioning to DevSecOps? Because you brought transition. I have my own opinion on that front, but how would you approach transitioning to DevSecOps? Let's say if you're an Agile practice, but you don't have security embedded. Is that a fast process, slow process? What's the best practices? And then what happens when you do it wrong?
Wow, that's a lot for you to cover in 5 minutes. Let's break it down, because I talked a lot in this session, and I think you have lots and lots of valuable things to say. What's your top thing? And I'll talk about mine.
I'm usually very opinionated on what I see. The transitional,
That's both of us.
It is who I am. I don't have more than one face. The context is fast. I find that if you maintain the duality too long, you might lose people who are change agents because they can't manage the burden. So I know that people say, try it out. I'm not. I get the support, get the agents, transition as fast as possible so that the duality doesn't crush those that are your heroes, that are going to move from heroes to innovators because of the changes, but you got to get them there before it falls. That's how I've approached it. But a lot of organizations like slow and steady, but I don't think they realize the impact on their personnel.
I agree. I would argue that there are lots of people who are not ready to take the plunge. There's lots of studies around early adopters versus late adopters and that whole path. And so usually what I think we've had this conversation before is really reorganizing teams so that you bucket the early adopters and those people who are super keen to be doing that into very specific groups so that they can go ahead and they can pave the path and then they can show people how it's done. And the people who are like, oh, I don't really want to go there and are the very typical, like, no, don't make me do this because I'm going to, put up roadblocks because I'm very uncomfortable. Like, you got to give give the people some time. So really a little bit of a reshuffling if you can, to allow people to go at their own pace to some degree for some parts of it, and then go at a different pace for other parts of it is definitely needed. But I mean, in general, like, with you that the whole organization should try to make a little bit more of an abrupt change, but it can't be. I mean, change management still has to happen, right?
Well, we haven't gone to that topic. We don't have time for change
I
management,
know.
which is a huge piece of it. But I feel, based on what you said, is the importance of empathy in a training plan. I kind of feel like IT wasn't really the area of empathy, but with DevSecOps and DevOps, empathy becomes core.
Yeah,
But
you can't get away without it.
I will state that regardless of your starting point, if your starting point is how do I make folders on my desktop and I need to operate DevSecOps, with the right training plan and the right team behind you, 3 to 4 months, they'll be one of the most advanced engineers out there because you've taken the empathy, you've built a training plan that caters to building their success, regardless of being restrictive to, oh, I'll just teach you DevSecOps. No, your training plan needs to be wide. Sit with the person, work through all of the components needed to make it successful. It doesn't matter if your starting point is, I don't know how to use my desktop. You can get to DevSecOps in a short period of time as long as you have a partner that's actually there to make you successful, regardless of the technical challenges that you face, to adopt complex methods. Once you're there, then you foster others. So fast, regardless of starting point, is doable as long as the partner has the training materials and personnel available to get that team going, what we would consider bolting. Like people say crawl, walk, run. No, there's bolting, and it looks way better than the best practices in the market. You just have to have the right trainer.
Fair enough. I think when I think about it, I always think like that prep period is there's a prep period before you get to the point where you're like, okay, we're on the ground, we're rolling this thing out. Rollout should be fast for sure, but the prep is going to take a while.
Love that. I love that. You're basically saying prep before you actually do anything.
Yeah.
I love it.
Ask yourself why, right?
We find that as one of our major findings with all of our very engagements is if you come to a team that's not ready, don't start creating anything. Make them ready, then create together. That's very important because that's with you instead of to you. And I kind of feel like DevSecOps can't be to you. That's how security operates today. It's to you. No, it's with you now. And if I'm going to do that, you need to be ready to participate, be it the application security team, information security team. And I think we're just running out of time. So if anything you'd like to say to close?
Yeah, from a business perspective, people ask me what's the top thing to kind of understand as I'm changing my business model. And when people go to DevSecOps, they often also go to cloud, and then they offer DevSecOps as a service, as they should, right? And so what they need to start thinking about as an organization is how, like, now if you look at their shared responsibility model, they're not just taking on the cloud shared responsibility model, they're also becoming a platform as a service or a software as a service or even a function as a service provider. right? So they'll need all the functions in addition to the people that they already have. If they want to be super successful, you need all the other functions that like a software as a service or a platform as a service company actually has. So things like your customer success, your like sales and marketing people, your like support personnel for all of those types of things. You need to think about that service model as an internal other business like process that you now have and that you're now supporting and that you're now working through an operating model for it. And there's lots of companies and like resources that you can use to think about it. But if you haven't thought about it, about what it is that you're offering as a DevSecOps practice, then the chances of failure are super high. That's what I think.
Agreed.
Any
So
comments from
closing
you?
words, because I
Yes.
don't want to run too much over. I think if you find partners that are dedicated to your success, that have the assets to help you accelerate, I think that's the most important thing you can do, because sometimes trying to do it yourself when the team isn't ready, it's very hard to achieve. So there's nothing wrong with looking for help. And I find that's the most unique thing that doesn't occur, is a lot of teams try to do it internally, but the people that are out there to help have been doing this for years. So reach out, find partners that help you, find people who do great speeches on conferences together, and have a great panel.
Yeah, I agree.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining Cyber Tech and Risk and Trust Cloud topic. Cheers.